2. A tool is as good as its maker. When the required material has been found, careful working is vital. The books of Carwyn, claws sharp as Terwyn steel, locked over her shoulder, yet curiously she felt no pain. It was as though the great bird thing upheld her even as it perched upon her. She twisted her head around and found herself looking into eyes as red as hellfire, as old as time. Cruel, they were, with a timeless dispassion, yet knowing, kindly, friendly, all at the same time. She shuddered, feeling the talons bite into her skin. Yet when she looked for blood marks, there were none. And then the bird was gone, if bird it was, beating up into the night on wings loud as thunder and silent as snowfall. Its blackness disappeared amongst the star-pricked darkness of the night, and it was gone. She started, as a person waking from a dream starts, remembering, yet only half believing. And she turned to Spellbinder. What was it? What happens? The man smiled, reaching out to touch her arm. Soft was his touch, and gentle, now, as his pale eyes, many things, Raven. And upon them, the world turns. As to the bird. It accepted you. And had it not? You live still, it accepted you. Had it not, you would be dead. He watched her face as he spoke, his voice assuming once again the chant tone, black its wings, and black its soul, bird of night and bird of knowing, heed its call and heed its sowing. Take the seed and let it grow, all within your own soul growing, what say you? Her voice was frightened. Yet defiant. What means the bird to me? Everything, he answered, simply. The books tell of your coming. The bird was chosen to recognize you. The lore of Carwyn has it so, Carwyn? Now she was frightened. What has the ghost elf to do with me? Spellbinder smiled reassuringly, knowing the fear the name aroused in mortals. In a world of struggling city-states and infant kingdoms, the Isle of Mists represented an enclave of half-guessed knowledge, and a xenophobic terror. Nothing and everything, he said quietly. Better to ask what you have to do with it. In time, it will be explained, for now I cannot tell you. Know that you are safe, know that you have a destiny greater than the lion slave pens, know that you have 2 friends, sword companions, myself and the bird. Sword companions? Her lustrous blue eyes grew wide with surprise. What know I of swords? How sword companions, soon, smiled the man in black, you shall know. For now, let us over and join the others. There is much you must learn from Arger, my teaching will come as it comes. He took her elbow, and his hand was ice and fire-naked flesh, and she knew that she was safe in his care. And safer still in the care of the blackbird, though how she knew it, she could not tell. The knowing was enough in itself, and she crossed the sword as a queen on the arm of her champion, accepting the admiring glances of the outlaws as a queen drinks in the admiration of courtiers. They reached the center of the feast circle and halted. This, said Spellbinder, is Raven. There was a gasp of surprise, a susurration of sound as men turned to whisper to one another, then a giant lifted to his feet, his hair red gold in the firelight. I am Arger. His voice was the deep bass she had heard upon the battlefield. I welcome you, Raven. Places were cleared to the right of the outlaw, and she sank down onto rich cushions of saran silk, decorated with bright pieces of metal and glass. A girl brought her plate and goblet. And she ate and drank with the free company. They were friendly, but curiously subdued, as though aware of some status she had no knowledge of, like servitors at the table of a monarch. Throughout the meal, Spellbinder steered the conversation into channels of discussion that gradually led her into the realization that he was laying a path of some kind. Of him, she learned little, of the others, much. They were an outlaw band, giving allegiance to no master, preferring the precarious freedom of the deserts and the outlands to the confines of the cities. Arger was their leader, a war-scarred soldier of Xandron origin, whose sword had been lifted in 1,000 causes, its weight measured in gold. Twice, he had risen to the elevated status of swordmaster, and each time his free spirit and sparking temper had brought him down to not more than a runaway warrior, a masterless sword-bearer. Of weaponry, he knew much, though Spellbinder was clearly the mind that directed the sword. He agreed to teach her the weaponmaster's arts. She awoke with a wine-thick head and a suit of mail set beside her bed. Spellbinder waited, smiling a secret knowledge, food set before him so that her stomach cried out and she hurried to bathe and dress. Again, the water in the tub was oddly warm, and she rose, naked, and she was refreshed, the effects of the wine dispelled like morning mist by a breeze. Eagerly, she studied the clothing laid out for her inspection. There was a soft linen singlet that barely covered her body, and a shirt of fine-linked mail of the same black metal that Spellbinder wore. She drew them both on, belting a wide, Xandhide sword girdle around her waist. The belt tugged in the mail shirt so that her thighs and legs were exposed, the sleeves cut off at the shoulder to bare her arms. She found a Ishkarian sleeve shield, and buckled the hard metal over her left arm, the slender plate protecting her from wrist to elbow, its sharpened edge extending beyond her hand. Over her legs, she drew metal-studded boots of ear leather that reached above her knees, fastening with drawstrings around her lower thighs. She left the silver torque upon her right arm, and the bracelet on her left wrist. Around her tumultuous golden hair she wound a heavy thread of beaten platinum, holding the cascade of locks back from her face. There was a sword of silver metal, the hilt wrapped round with goldwork, and a huge green gemstone surmounting the pommel. Beside it lay a scabbard of black sand hide worked with silver chasings, next to that a slender dagger of black metal in a matched sheath. When she emerged from the rear of the black tent, Spellbinder whistled softly, his eyes appraising her body. Now, he said quietly, you look like a warrior princess. She was both pleased at his admiration and oddly disturbed. The great silver mirror had told her that she would please a man, but she remained cautious of the effects. Aware of the last time a man had surveyed her in that manner, Spellbinder smiled. Fear not, Raven. For now, you must learn to use those weapons. Those and many others. Until you can stand head to head with any man alive. And beat most. Here, you choose your bed companions. Any who might argue that answer to me. She smiled and joined him in the breaking of the night's fast. After that, the work began. Arger was waiting for them on a strip of cleared and packed sand. He wore a loincloth and a sleeve shield, in his huge right hand, a long, straight-bladed sword. He grinned and swung it without warning. The girl ducked instinctively beneath the cut, darting to one side as she tugged her own blade clumsily from the ornate scabbard. Arger's sword curved back in a double-handed blow that halted scant inches from her neck. The proximity of the steel angered her, and she cut upwards, striking sparks from the outlaw's blade. He laughed and turned the cut, twisting his own steel to dart the point against her belly. She fell back, shrieking her rage and swung her sword in a vicious slice towards his ankles. As the blade cleaved air, the outlaw jumped up, dropping down to trap her blade against the sand. His own touched light upon her neck. Anger, he said evenly, is a wasted emotion. When you fight a man you must contain yourself. Anger makes a man careless, and carelessness breeds death. He lifted the sword and she rose to her feet. Without think-ing, she ran in, cleaving the gap between them in wild, two-handed strokes, once, twice, 3 times. Arger glanced her blade off his, then she was close to him and felt his arms go around her, the edge of his sword press heavy against her spine. Never close with a man until you are sure of killing him. The outlaw increased the pressure to emphasize his point. Kill from distance when you can. She lifted a knee to ram against his bowels. And yelped as it glanced off a thigh hard as forged steel. Never show your intentions in your eyes, grinned Arger. That way, you tell your opponent what to expect. Calm, little Raven, calm. You must always be calm when you face death. He shoved her backwards, and she pitched onto the sand, slender thighs flailing over blonde-maned head. And came up cursing. Arger laughed, parrying her stroke with the sleeve shield. His own blade darted around her as a wasp flits past its prey, touching, lifting out and away, thrusting in again until she howled her frustration and threw her sword at him. He caught the blade in midair, pitching it away over the sand. Fetch it. Snarling, she ran to retrieve the blade. Her hand was closing on the hilt when Arger's dagger glanced, flat-side, across her fingers to embed itself hilt deep in the sand beyond. Never turn your back on an armed man. His voice cheerful, unwinded. And remember that weapons can be thrown accurately. Cursing, wondering why she must learn all this, the girl went back to the attack. She kept it up until her arm ached from swinging the sword, her shield arm from the answering blows of the big outlaw. Then he grinned again and threw his blade to Spellbinder. Come, little one. Let's see how you can run. He started out over the sand, bare feet thudding against the burning gold. Snarling, her sword clutched by the guard in her left hand, Raven started after him, determined to sink the blade into his back. They ran until she felt the desert burning into her lungs like the inhalation of torches. Her vision swam before her and her legs felt numb and nerveless, but still she ran. After a while, she realized they had come round in a circle and were approaching the oasis again, and forced her aching legs to pump harder in a desperate attempt to catch the tall outlaw. When she reached the palms, and collapsed, Arger was chuckling above her, Spellbinder watching with objective interest. She'll do. Grunted the outlaw. She has the belly for it. He laughed, reaching down to haul her to her feet. When she cut at him with the silver sword, he turned it aside, twisting her wrist so that the blade fell from her splayed fingers. Never forget that your hands are weapons, too. Learn to use them. He grabbed her as she tried to ram stiffened fingers into his eyes. Good, good. The deep voice was amused and respectful. You have the temper for it. And you're strong enough. It will take time. But I'll make you a sword mistress yet. she was too angry to understand the import of his words, though in time they were made clear. It was a time of hardship and learning, of joy and of despair. Arger was a demanding tutor, and the placement of his lessons was forced upon him by the exigencies of his outlaw situation. Spellbinder went away into the desert after the first week, and she never saw the strange black bird. It seemed, almost, as though she saw nothing but the flash of Arger's sword. The curve of his bow. He drilled her with relentless purpose, teaching her the usage of the broadsword, the Karsamian saber and the scimitars of Zandrone. She learned to fight with the short stabbing sword of Sarah, and the long-bladed throwing knives of Lyand. She learned to protect her body with a full-sized war shield and the lighter, more versatile sleeve shield of Iskar. She learned the use of the longbow and the shortbow, the spear and the javelin, the strange Zandrone bolus and the lethal throwing stars used by the Zand riders. While she learned all this, the outlaw camp shifted from oasis to rocky wastelands, moving south and east into the heat hell beyond the walled cities, swinging north to raid a slave train, then west against to loot a consignment of Saran wine. Through it all, the girl who now thought of herself as Raven learned the craft of camouflage and desert lore. She learned to follow a trail and to hide herself where none but the knowledgeable might find her, to kill without warning or quarter. To defend herself, she became an outlaw. She learned to kill and to hide. To ride with one of the big crag bows thrumming death from the flanks of horse or Zand. Her skin tanned beneath the kiss of sun and wind, and she used a sword as expertly as any man. She could bring a rider down unharmed with the bolus, or cut his throat away with the throwing stars, pin him with a javelin or a spear, lasso him or tilt him from his mount with her bare hands. She could wrestle and throw most of her opponents and apply the cunning grips of sly to steal sleep over the nerves of her combatants. She learned to kill without compassion. She learned to stay alive in a hostile land. And after a year, Spellbinder came back. He came out of a burning afternoon, the sun glinting from the night-black shoulders of his mailed war shirt, shining the paleness of his eyes. He carried a lance in his right hand, and above his head there wheeled and spiraled a great black bird. How he could find the hidden camp she could not guess, but when she saw him her heart jumped and her lips spread in a smile of welcome. He grounded the lance, and smiled in answer to her smile. His face spoke of remembrance and of pleasure, of admiration and of joy. Somehow, for no reason she could understand or define, it justified the long sojourn in the lawless wilderness and, with a shock of surprise, she realized that she had never questioned his absence, or the long months of her arduous training. Somehow, she had accepted that it was correct, even needful, to learn the weapon skills Arger had taught her, without ever asking why. One part of her mind told her she had stayed with the outlaws because she was a runaway slave, another that she sought to destroy Carl Ir Donwain with his own weapons. Yet throughout the year of learning and killing, she had almost forgotten three things. One was Spellbinder. His absence had seemed oddly natural, not to be questioned. The second was the black bird. When it departed she had accepted that it would come back in its own time. That it would come back, she never doubted. When, she never worried about. The third thing was the savage belligerence with which she greeted the night advances of the outlaws. Arger, since their first meeting, had never treated her as anything other than a sword companion. Though he was a lusty man who quite clearly wanted her body, others of the band were less respectful, and 3 times she had crippled men who sought to lay claim to her womanhood, yet during those long months of raiding and hiding, such thoughts had never crossed her mind. Now, she wondered why. Had Spellbinder cast some magic upon her? Or had the black bird entranced her with its grip? She moved forward with questions rampant on her lips. Spellbinder watched her, the cool, calm, smile still firm, upon his unmasked face. Why? Was all she said. What I shall explain tomorrow, he replied. 3. Forge it well. Clean and true must be the making, else it fails you in the vital hour. The books of Carwin. They sat beside a rancid sulfur spring in the wastelands south of the 3 cities. Arger was bent on a raid upon the tiny port of Xantar, and not even Spellbinder's softly persuasive tongue could dissuade the outlaw from his violent purpose. So they made the best of their time. On Raven's part, it was mostly taken up with questions, for she felt as though a veil had been lifted from her mind. Unshadowing the past as a mummer's curtain might be lifted to reveal the pantomime secrets of the nether stage. Yet Spellbinder answered them with the calm of a Lyandian tutor versing an innocent in the arts of the filer harp. Yes, he said, I put a spell upon you. It was necessary to achieve the ultimate purpose. Therefore, you had to learn all that Arger might teach you. He tells me you have learned well, but that we can ascertain tomorrow, in Xantar. Why did you accept it? No spell is powerful enough to override the will of an unwilling subject. I know not. Thoughts burst in upon her mind even as she said it, each one conflicting with its mate, so that she shook her head and wondered why she spoke as she did. It seemed right. So it goes, murmured Spellbinder. He looked away, towards where the black bird strutted over the sand, its heavy bill channeling tasty grubs from the arid soil. The creature looked up as he clacked his tongue, turning knowing eyes upon them both. Spellbinder smiled, as though he had agreed something with the bird. And spoke, to each is vouchsafed a little knowledge, to some the opportunity to change it. What do you know of the geography of this world of ours? Raven shook her head, very little. We live, said Spellbinder, around a great central sea. Within that sea are two islands, Carwin and Crag. At the moment, neither need concern you unduly. Around that sea are many lands, though few are mapped, and few are known. We rest in the southern wastelands, beyond the three cities of Lyand, Sarah, and Varthan. East of the sea are Karsum, the Altan's empire, and Terwind, the city of steel. To the west are Ishkar, Sly, and Zandrone. To the north, Forgotten Quan, the ice country. There are places between, but they are of no concern, ports and villages too small to sway the balance of the world. The three cities, Sarah, Lyand, and Varthan, are ambitious merchant empires, hungry to spread their tentacles of commerce across the face of the world. They struggle amongst themselves, and with any other city that attempts to usurp their power. Their aim is a commercial order. The western lands, we can forget. Your own homeland of Ishkar is no more than an outpost, divided between the farmers and the beastmen. Sly is ruled by the Black Ones, and they want nothing more than to be left alone. The cattle kings of Zandrone are content to ride their steplands unhindered by civilization. Together, they amount to nothing. Quan, I might admit, is unknown, but the ice sea separates whatever or whoever lives amongst the glaciers from the rest of the world. And what else is there? Terwind, Xanter, Quell? All are minor pawns in the greater game. The balance of the world, the one we know, rests between the three cities, Karsum and Crag. You say nothing, ventured Raven, of Carwin. Yet rumor has it the sorcerer priests keep their hands to the pivot of the world. Rumor has it, too, that you are of Carwin birth, or how else the bird, your powers, Spellbinder shrugged, smiling, perhaps. But so things go. Were it so, would you forsake me? Raven shook her head. No, why not? I know not. You helped me, I trust you. You trust Argur, yes, but that seems different. Argur is a sword companion. You are, something else, what? Spellbinder asked. Raven smiled, suddenly sure of herself, suddenly aware of the long months of waiting. She rose to her feet in one lithe movement, hands darting to sword belt and mail buckling. Sword and sleeve shield and armored shirt dropped to the sand. Linen shift followed, so that she stood clad only in the high, leather boots. Slowly, smiling, she slid her hands over the soft contours of her body. Lascivious she was, and demanding in her need, impatient for him to shed the black and silver armor. And when it was gone, she fell upon him like some ravening beast. Her mouth hunted over his body, lifting him, rousing him, until he groaned a joyful anguish and pitched her over onto her naked back. She felt the sandworm beneath her buttocks, screamed as he entered her, then writhed and strove against his hard body as they sought the ultimate communion. Her nails raked his flesh as he brought her to climactic satisfaction, and his groans matched her screaming across the empty sands. Yards away, still grubbing food from the dry soil, the blackbird turned a knowing eye upon their interlocked bodies. Its great head rose from the furrowed earth, nodding as though in approval, and a raucous croak burst from its opened beak. Then, as though satisfied by what it had seen, it spread its wings and lifted skywards. Once, it circled them, still cawing its cry, and then was gone. Spellbinder fetched back on his elbows, watching the bird disappear, his pale eyes amused and gratified. He stayed like that until the black shape was gone from sight, then rose to his feet. Come. He began to dress as he said it. Argur will want to plan the raid. Raven stood up, her lissom body sheened with the sweat of their lovemaking, curiosity bright in her own blue eyes. What of the bird, Spellbinder? What does it mean to me? Wait, he said, and took her to their horses. Argur's plan was simple and left Raven no time for further questions. He planned to break camp after sunset, and ride through the night to reach Xanter by daybreak. His spies had informed him of an Ishkarian merchantman due to dock at dawn with a cargo of pelts, wines, and weapons. All were destined for Sarah, and that city, it seemed, held sour memories for the outlawed mercenary. Equally, it appeared that Sarah was embroiled in yet another war with Lyand, a second township with which Argur held no truck, and the outlaw planned to sell the merchandise to Lyand, and, the gods permitting, take it back again to resell to Sarah. It was an ambitious, convoluted plan, but Raven and, too, it seemed, Spellbinder, were accustomed to Argur's thinking. They went along with him, both happy in their own ways. You have learned well, but that we can ascertain tomorrow, in Xanter. Spellbinder's words rang in her ears as she rode towards the little port. He had told her, asked her, to wait. And wait she would. It was as though she must first prove herself in battle, strip away the first layer of the veil, after that would come the others, one by one, until his true meaning was revealed. She smiled, hefting her sword in its sheath, admiring the play of early sunlight on the wrought-work of the tang and hilt, suddenly eager for battle and for bloodshed, for a chance to prove herself to the strange warrior in black and silver who rode at her flank. They reached the little town shortly after dawn, and Arger took his squadron straight through the central cluster of buildings. There were no streets as such, only meandering avenues that ran between low, quiet houses of bright painted stucco, the richer dwellings decorated with tiles and murals of many colors. As they went through, lights gleamed and shutters hurtled back, but when the inhabitants saw the armed band they drew back into their dwellings, preferring to ignore the implications of riders at dawn to the dangers of armed combat. Around the harbor there was a token guard, more dutiful than their pay warranted. By the time 3 of them had died with lances in their chests, the others opted to survive, and fled in careless abandon. Their scanty defense, however, had given the Ishkarians time to organize their own opposition. Arger's first charge was met with a rain of arrows that drove him back. In a torrent of curses thicker than the shafts falling around his fleeing horse, he split his forces, telling off 10 men to vest themselves of their armor and swim around the ship before the merchants could cast off. A second group was set to guard their rear, and the remainder concentrated on the frontal assault. Raven crouched beside the big outlaw, her eyes fixed on Spellbinder. The pale man was smiling in anticipation, his lips drawn back from his teeth and his eyes wide with barely contained excitement. Raven herself was conscious of the same ardor. It was as though battle called out to her blood, to some dark corner of her soul, crying for usage of the sword and throwing stars, howling for death as the slave hounds had howled for her body. She smiled at Spellbinder and waited for Arger's signal. It came as the first man appeared over the merchant's poop deck. A naked, dripping outlaw slid a knife across the helmsman's throat, and as the nearest sailor turned, a second swimmer cut him down with a thrown knife. Even as they fell, Arger bellowed his attack cry, and the outlaws charged the boat. Raven was in the forefront of the charge. The Ishkarians had drawn up the gangplank, so she crossed the gap between wharf and vessel in a single, long-legged spring that carried her clear to the center of the low deck. Instantly she was surrounded by yelling sailors, wielding wide-bladed Ishkarian cutlasses. Smiling, screaming, she cut around her with the slender Terwin's saber. She parried 3 blows with her sleeve shield, cut a man with each parry, down 2 more with blows of the shield. And found herself alone. Across the deck, Spellbinder was hacking down the last of 5 foolish sailors, and Arger stood astride the steering deck with his broadsword stuck through the master's belly. Behind him, 2 sailors crept over the planks, cutlasses lifted for the killing stroke. The outlaw's sword grated on bone, and he cursed as he raised a foot to jar the blade loose from the corpse's stomach. The cutlasses lifted, one poised to either side of Arger's head. Together they would cleave his skull from its base. Leaving it grinning on the blood-stained planks, Raven dropped her sword, leaving the blade to embed itself in the deck. In the same swift movement, her right hand dropped to her belt, where the Xandron throwing stars were fastened. She plucked one free and flicked it up and over the deck. An Ishkarian screamed as the razor-edged star sank deep into his windpipe, and as he choked on his own blood, his cutlass dropped from his nerveless fingers. Arger turned, startled, and saw the second sailor fall with a star bedded deep in his ribs. The man staggered for a moment, then pitched over the side of the ship. Raven cursed as she saw a good weapon lost, then turned as 3 hefty sailors converged on her. She parried one blade with her shield, took the second on her mail, and saw the third dissolve in a spray of blood as the hand was severed from the wrist by Spellbinder's sword. One belligerent turned towards the black and silver warrior, the other towards the girl. She backed away, unable to reach her sword, the distance between them too short to use a star, and clutched for her knife. Before she could bring it up to thrust, the sailor smashed it from her hand with one windmilling swipe of his cutlass. Grinning, he closed in. Raven backed up until she felt the bulwarks against her thighs, then ducked low beneath a clumsy swing. She clenched her fist and drove the sleeve, shield hard against the burly sailor's midriff, as Arger had taught her. During their lessons the outlaw had used a padded waistcoat to protect him from the sharpened tip of the Ishkarian shield. The sailor had no such padding, and the thing caught him below his ribs, between the curve of the bones and his navel. It sank in and came out bloody, and he screamed, dropping his cutlass, doubling over the pain. Raven swung the metal up in a great curving blow that cleaved through his neck and lower jaw so that he spat blood and died with his gaze, still fixed in surprise on the slender figure of his nemesis. Over the deck Spellbinder had finished his opponent with a flailing, double-handed blow that took the man's head from his shoulders in crimson disarray. Then the boat was theirs and they took their horses on board and cast off for Lyand. And above them, high in the clear sky, a faint, black shape whirled and tumbled on the air currents. And Raven saw it and laughed, throwing her head back and yelling her satisfaction to the heavens. They sailed for 5 days, moving north and east around the coast. The horses grew restless on the low deck, even though the sea was calm and there were no squalls to mar their passage, and the men became equally unrestful as they passed landfalls ignored by Arger. Finally, though, they reached Gorm, a tiny seaport nestling in a cliff-hung cove betwixt Sarah and Lyand. Sarah they had passed by night, slipping by the watch ships under cover of darkness, to fetch up in a lonely bay that sheltered them through the sunlit hours until darkness allowed escape from the Lyand vessels. They hung to the rocky shore with the waves washed dangerous in their ears, until Gorm hove in sight and Arger called a landfall. Few there were who were not grateful for that. For not many wore sea legs beneath their boots and mail, and the sailing had been a hard thing for Arger's men. The outlaw leader was as used to a ship's deck as he was to a saddle, or a Zan's back, and Spellbinder seemed at ease on the rolling planks of the vessel. Raven was, at first, queasy, though she assumed her sea legs faster than most, and easier. But even so, she was grateful to feel solid land beneath her boots when she stepped ashore at Gorm. The harbor was owned by a local warlord called Titus, who welcomed them to his wooden-walled enclave as a nervous man welcomes those he feels too strong to refuse. Arger accepted the hospitality, even though he left a quarter of his men on board the ship, and a second quarter spread out around the welcome hall. Those who entered kept their weapons close by their sides, and they drank and ate with their left hands so far as it was possible. For the most part, the feasting went quietly. Titus of Gorm boasted no more than a scanty guard of 70 men, and those subdued in the presence of the reavers, who numbered, in the hall 30. The food was middling good, roasted meats and succulent vegetables washed down with rich Saran wine, and by the time they set to picking over the cheeses Arger and Titus were huddled in conversation like two merchants planning joint purchase. There was much secretive muttering, and slapping of backs, and finally Arger held out one beefy paw with a broad smile gleaming through his beard. Titus gripped the hand, lifting his goblet to seal whatever bargain they had struck, and Arger beamed, pleased with himself. Later, he took Spellbinder and Raven aside to explain his arrangement. In return for a tithe on the profits, Titus would store the looted merchandise in Gorm and arrange a meeting with the relevant citizens of Lyand. It would mean a small loss, but was infinitely safer than Arger, or any of the others, attempting to approach Lyand directly. The city had a long memory and a short temper where the outlaws were concerned. Satisfied, they settled down to sleep on the straw provided by their new partner. Bread and meat, accompanied by wine and mugs of steaming, bitter chaffa, were brought in the morning. Arger planned to rest up in Gorm until their deal was concluded, then take the merchantmen up the coast in search of fresh loot. Spellbinder entertained other thoughts. It's been a year or more since I saw Lyand, he remarked casually. I have it in mind to visit her once again. Shroud of the Stone. Arger grinned, approving disbelief. Think you to ride out again? They'll know that pale face of yours on the instant. And mount it over the gates. There are disguises, shrugged Spellbinder. And I like it not when men can find my comings and my goings. I shall visit Lyand. Arger shook his head, chuckling, and Raven was prompted to ask what crime would occasion her lover's decapitation. Hi. Arger slapped the table, smiling at the memory. They'd as lief welcome Spellbinder to their pretty little city as they'd welcome a pack of blood-mad beastmen. 3 years ago I was better liked in Lyand, even found employment there as a swordmaster. Quell and Terwind felt the push of Lyand-ian ambition and allied themselves with Falger. The 3 little cities marched on Lyand, and there were some pleasant fights to fill a mercenary's purse with bright gold. Lyand won the struggle, though feelings ran high for months after. I was investing part of my pay in decent wine, in a tavern owned by a charming friend of mine. She's so charming she attracts every disease in the 3 cities, grunted Spellbinder. Arger ignored the interruption, his smile lascivious with memory. A fight broke out. 5 of Lyand's city guard thought to have found a Terwind spy. The poor fellow was struggling to defend himself, though he had little chance as I guessed it. Spellbinder snorted in disgust. Hard-pressed, he was, continued Arger, and liked to fall beneath their swords. I was paid off and of a benevolent nature, so I took pity on the hapless fellow. I drew my sword and cut 2 of the guardsmen with one magnificent stroke. The others turned on me, and my defense threw them back, against the unfortunate fellow. He managed to account for one of them, whilst I slew the others with 2 devastating strokes. The blood was thick upon the sawdust, and it was guardsman blood. I could only flee, taking the unfortunate with me, else he should be blamed for the slaughter. We took a pair of handy horses and escaped to the outlands, where we introduced ourselves. Spellbinder, he called himself, as Arger finished his narration. Spellbinder choked on his wine, tears of laughter running down his lean face. Braggart, he spluttered. Liar. Boaster. There were 3 guardsmen, the extra 2 were supplied by your wine-fuddled eyes. I killed one before you even managed to untangle yourself from the arms of that painted strumpet. 1 you slew. As I recall, you staggered in your drunkenness and knocked him over when you fell against him. The 3rd, I took. Perhaps. Arger filled a third goblet. But Lion would still welcome both our heads as watch skulls on the gate. So I'll darken my face and change my clothing. There's no more danger in it than trusting in Titus. Arger grimaced and was about to speak again, but Raven interrupted him. I'll come with you. I'd leave see the city again, maybe Don Wayne, too. A sudden silence fell upon the men, as though both were nervous of such a meeting. Then, slowly, Spellbinder nodded. Very well. It's unlikely anyone will recognize you, but follow my example, act as I do. And remember that caution must be our watchword. Raven smiled her agreement, suddenly excited at the prospect of seeing hated Lion again. For, whatever the weapon, it must be tested. The making may have concealed imperfections such as show only in use. The books of Carwin, the city rose like a jewel from the yellow sand. Its contours were those of the country around it, undulating softly upwards in shades of gold and ochre and brown. Around the farthest perimeter, there stretched a great wall, twice the height of a tall man. It was a stone-built thing, the sun-mellowed rock washed by the light to the same shades as glazed up from the desert. Along the top was a wooden barrier, some 5 feet high, behind which stood archers and javelin men. Beyond the wall Raven could see the familiar spires of the place reflecting the afternoon sun in a myriad patterns of dancing light. The spires were built of the same solid stone as the wall, though colored, so that they shone blue and green and gray, silver and gold, dark umber and deeper black, iridescent, they were, the cupola surmounting each structure bright gold where the sun struck from the beaten metal plates. At several places along the wall were gates. Each one a massive, heavy timbered thing of weathered beams and great metal rivets, inset with small watchdoors and peepholes. Around each gate there were cave-like openings in the stone of the wall, black holes little higher than a man's thigh. Those, Raven knew, were the exit points for the slave hounds. She shuddered at the thought, as they approached the main gates, crossbows sighted upon them, and the harsh voice of the watch sergeant called for them to halt. They reined in, waiting while a section of the fortified gate was swung open to reveal a space just wide enough for a single horse to pass through. Then they were beckoned on. Spellbinder led the way. He had applied a dye to his skin, so that he appeared swarthy as some Xandron herder, and in place of his armor he wore flowing robes of a rich brown color. Beneath the folds of cloth there was a mail war shirt, and daggers were hidden about his person. Raven was similarly disguised in robes of virginal white. A deep-fronted cowl obscuring her features. She, too, wore mail beneath the robe and carried a knife in addition to the throwing stars belted around her slender waist. Who comes? An officer appeared in the entrance, behind him, a troop of swordsmen, 2 wanderers, shouted Spellbinder. Pilgrims out of Gorm, bound for the north. Ride closer. Spellbinder urged his mount through the portal, Raven close at his back. They were allowed to enter the gate, finding themselves in a stone-walled enclave betwixt the great outer wall and a smaller inner circle. Between both walls there was an open space, blocked off from the entry gate by sturdy wooden palings. Within the space paced the gaunt shapes of the slave hounds, while the upper reaches of both walls were patrolled by archers. What business have you in Lion? For the captain of a merchant city's army, the officer was distinctly unfriendly. How came you here? We seek rest and a safe place to pass the night, answered Spellbinder. The southern wastes are a trifle unfriendly to unarmed travelers. As to our coming, why, we rode here. Bound for the north, you said, grunted the soldier. Why? We go to worship at the temple of the stone in Quell, said Spellbinder, softly, so, stone kissers. The tone was contemptuous. Then there's little to fear from you. Pass on. The appellation of stone pilgrims was sufficient passport to allow them entry into the city. Though both wondered why the merchant center closed her defenses so tight, they found out when they reached the tavern Arger had described to them. There the greeting was warm. It was a small, snug place, redolent of pungent kif and spilled wine. Rich odors of cooking meat entranced their stomachs, and the smiling woman who came out to direct them to the stableyard was dumpy and flour-stained, a motherly figure totally unlike the surly watchman. Is she, asked Raven, Arger's paramour? Aye, whispered Spellbinder, chuckling, though it seems she's aged somewhat in the last years. What if she remembers you? Raven was abruptly conscious of the city patrols. What then? How should she know me? Spellbinder murmured. She saw me once, 3 years ago. Then I dressed in silver mail. Now, what am I? A humble pilgrim en route to Quell to bend my knee to the stone. Soon, replied Raven, you must tell me what this stone is, that it calls for pilgrims. I've not heard of it before. Soon, smiled Spellbinder, you shall see it for yourself and you. Then you may learn a little more about your future. He turned before Raven could ask a further question. And she followed him into the tavern, irritated and intrigued. It seemed that some great design unwove about her, revealing itself in small parts. She lusted to know the whole of it, yet simultaneously realized, intuitively, that it must come in fragments. What I shall explain. Those had been Spellbinder's words, and slowly, little bit by little, he had revealed things to her. Still, however, she felt that he kept much back, knew far more of her future, were that possible, than he revealed. Certainly, she felt, he was guiding her into a particular path, steering her towards some destiny she knew nothing of. Though, still, she felt unable to argue against it, there was something in Spellbinder that compelled her to heed him, whatever his purpose. It was as though he held her entranced, bound round by the magic Arger's men had hinted he controlled. What is he? She wondered, studying the broad back disappearing into the tavern, a bandit? Or something more? Is he from the Isle of Ghosts? Some sorcerer priest who works his secret purpose on the world for his own strange ends? Or what? No ordinary outlaw, that for certain. But what is he? Her thoughts were broken off by the smell of food and the goblet of wine Spellbinder thrust into her hand. He had chosen them a secluded table to the rear of the tavern, sheltered from the main hall by a cobwebbed pillar. The other occupants were mostly, it appeared, local tradesmen and merchants, a few soldiers, and the customary sprinkling of doxies. Two pilgrims attracted no more attention than the odd glance and a muffled laugh at their robes. Yet Arger had advised them well, for above the planking of the serving table, set carefully out of the reach of drunken customers, hung a shard of granite. It was no more than a chip from some larger block of alluvial rock, but it was polished so that it glistened green and blue in the candle's light, the platinum chain suspending it from the low ceiling, shining palely silver above the duller gleam of the stone. A hole had been bored out to accommodate a silver ring, through which the chain was fastened. And a broad metal shade was mounted into the ceiling to protect the thing from smoke. Raven had never heard of the Stone of Quell, but when Spellbinder showed the tavern owner a silver ring surmounted by a tiny chip of rock, she began to realize its power. The woman backed away, her mouth opening in surprise as mumbled incantations fell from her lips. Then she came forward, taking Spellbinder's hands in hers to raise them to her mouth. She kissed his fingers and back away, still mouthing incoherent prayers. Spellbinder turned to Raven, smiling, "We shall fare well, here. Mistress Clara is a stone worshipper. She thinks me a priest of the sect, you, an acolyte." "What is the stone?" Raven asked. "Are you a priest of the cult?" "The stone," chuckled Spellbinder, cynicism tinging his words, "is a chunk from the nether end of a falling star. It came to Earth some 90 years ago, and was hailed as a falling god. It stands now, in Quell with a temple built around it, where people can go to worship a piece of senseless star rock. There is no more power in it than you'll find in a corpse, but legends are easily built, and people like to believe what they will, so, the priests grow fat on the donations of the worshippers, and wanderers like us find friends in falsity. Something is afoot in Lyand, and I must know what it is. Being a pilgrim to the stone is as good a reason as any for being here." "But are you not a priest of another cult?" Raven asked. "Which?" Spellbinder answered, evasively, "Carwyn," she said. "Are you not a sorcerer priest?" "Wait," was all he answered, "wait, if you will. Take it for now that I hold your interest. No, more than that, you, over all else. That I hold closest to my heart. In time I shall explain everything, but there must be time. The world turns and events depend upon the hands of those who turn it. Bide patient, Raven, and we'll do great things together. For now, though, wait if you will." She nodded, wondering. Mistress Clara returned with platters of rich-odored food and a large flask of decent wine. She served them herself, setting the victuals before Spellbinder as a worshipper sets an offering before the guardian of a god. Her treatment of Raven was respectful, but subtly less reverential after all. An acolyte does not have the status of a full-blown priest. Spellbinder waited until she had finished her ministrations, then motioned for her to join them. "What's afoot?" He spoke through a mouthful of food. "Lyand boasts more soldiery on her walls than flies on a dung pile. You've not heard?" Mistress Clara sounded surprised, though the affairs of Lyland should be common knowledge. Spellbinder shook his head. "Tell me." "Why, Sir Priest, the war horns trumpet again. These past months we've lost 7 caravans to raiders, and 4 ships to sea reavers. At first it was assumed they had fallen victim to common outlaws, but the word now is that Carsum ventures to extend her power. The Alton has been ever ambitious. And he feels his power threatened by the 3 cities. Urged on by his stone-damned bride, he flexes his muscles, planning to move against us." "Why stone-damned?" interrupted Spellbinder, adding by way of explanation for his ignorance, "I have been long in the wilderness." "His sister." Mistress Clara spat the words. Myrstel took to wife his own bloodkin, Kreia, proclaiming that he returned to the old ways, that the blood of the Myrstel Altans was too pure to mingle with that of a lesser person. Fag. She shaped a horn with her clenched fist, driving index and little finger at the table in the universal sign of disgust. Pure as the warped mind of a sister lover, how comes a tavern mistress to hold such knowledge? Spellbinder asked. Surely such matters are the province of the high powers, Mistress Clara set a grubby finger to the side of her nose. A tavern can be a sounding box, sensitive as the filer. One with ears to hear may listen to resonances of great interest. The soldiers favor this place knowing it to be clean and honest, and from them I hear much. Why, only 3 days ago I learned that the weaponmaster Don Wayne quit the city to seek sword service with the Altan. Beneath the table, out of sight of prying eyes, Spellbinder's hand clasped tight around Raven's thigh. His fingers probed for the nerves that would paralyze her leg, stifling her hate-born movement before she could rise in blood anger. So he reneged his tenure here in favor of the larger game? I nodded the tavern mistress, the eyes of that one were ever fixed on the greater game. So he quit Lyand when the gold glinted brighter to north, prompted Spellbinder. Clara nodded. Yes. While we prepare for war, he rides to the Altan, taking a full troop of beast men with him. So it goes, murmured Spellbinder. Beside him, Raven boiled with impatient fury. One reason for visiting Lyand again had been the opportunity of matching Carl Ir Don Wayne blade to blade. She lusted for the weaponmaster's death with a ferocity unknown until realized that she could wield a sword near as well as he. As a revenging runaway slave, she had entertained little hope of herself upon him. As a weapon-trained outlaw, she felt capable of besting him in fair battle. Now the opportunity seemed lost to her. Can we not follow him? She turned to Spellbinder as Mistress Clara left them, her eyes fervent within the cowl. He cannot be far ahead. Wait, murmured Spellbinder. There are greater games afoot than your vengeance. In time, perhaps, we shall catch him. Until then, be patient. That night, for the first time in many days, Raven did not go to the warrior's bed. When he sought to enter hers, she pushed him roughly away, mumbling curses as tears of frustrated rage coursed over her cheeks. Spellbinder accepted the rebuke, returning to his own pallet with a silent smile upon his lips. Calm, he settled himself for sleep, freeing his mind to wander through the possibilities and the plans of the greater design that stood around him. And around Raven. After a while, the images and the voices that wafted through his mind went away and he slept as sound as a child contented with its day's work. The next morning they toured Lyand, wandering those parts Raven, as a slave girl, had never seen. By day's light the hall of the weapons masters appeared a grim forbidding hulk of mingled wood and stone, decorated with the shields of past masters. Here and there, gaps showed in the lines of shields, and Spellbinder pointed to where Arger's buckler had once hung. And Raven, unaided, found the empty spot that should have carried Don Wayne's roundel. Outside the slave pens and the wharves, she realized, Lyand was a beautiful city, as an orchid, effete and dependent on support, is beautiful. Its streets wound in concentric circles from the great outer walls to the sea, wide paved chariot ways alternating with smaller avenues designed for pedestrians, the latter lined by small taverns and eating houses, the stalls of street vendors, and the dwellings of the citizens. Between the encircling streets, like the spokes of a wheel, ran tiny alleyways, from which emanated dark openings, minuscule windows, still smaller shops, and the rich smells and tiny noises of a bustling city. Food smells mingled with the sweat stink of horses and zans, the odor of tanning leather and fresh butchered meat. Wine hung in the air around the many taverns, and closer to the seafront there was the sharp, exhilarating tang of ozone and cured fish, over all the city of Lyand. There appeared a golden glow. It came from the cupolas surmounting the houses and the towers, beating down from the metal plates that spanned each rich dome, reflecting the desert sun onto the teeming multitudes scurrying the streets like ants in a hive. When they toured the outer walls the smell changed. There it became a rank odor of sweat and pain and blood, heavy with the growling of dogs. They stayed only a short time there, for they were too close to the slave pens, and Raven was full of too many memories. They left the city before sunset, Raven anxious to pursue Carl Ir Don Wayne, and Spellbinder bent upon some other pose he would not reveal to her. Their going was as inauspicious as their entry, and they reached the desert country beyond the walls without suspicion or pursuit. Beyond the view of the city's watchmen, they shed their pilgrim robes in favor of armor. Even around Lyand's walls there was danger from the great beasts that stalked the outland wastes. Twice in the night they heard the snuffling of some great monster such as stalked the southern sand, and came to their feet with sword or bow set ready for use. But none came close enough to present any real danger, and in the morning they started out, again, heading northwards to Quell. Why Quell? Raven asked. Speaking of the stone, you dismissed it as a foolish illusion. Why do we not ride straight for Karsum? I said, Spellbinder muttered from under the folds of his cloak, that foolish people worship the stone as a god. It is no more than a chunk of star-spawned rock, but it does hold certain properties that may be used by those who understand. Such as sorcerer priests? Raven demanded. Followers of Carwyn? Spellbinder huddled into his cloak. The wind was blowing stronger now, gusting sand like tiny pellets against their exposed skin, the desert heat sucking their breath from their lungs as though it was drawn away by some torturer, mounting heated bellows to their lips. Perhaps, was all Raven heard. And, wait. They rode out the dust storm and, for days later, came upon the outer defenses of Quell. Closer to Gorm than to Lyand was the City of the Stone. A palisade fortress of wood and rock that appeared to cling to the sand like a lamprey to a shark. Where Lyand flowed and swelled from its surroundings, Quell hulkied, stark and defensive. Its outlines were harsh, angular, buttresses and watchtowers took the place of domes and cupolas, and where bright metal and glistening paint had decorated Lyand, their Quell boasted black and heavy wood, ebon slate and gray-faced granite. The guard towers of the outer wall were of night-black stone, linked by the sharp-tipped timbers of the encircling wall. Before that wall stood a ring of metal-jutting spikes, high as a tall man might reach with his fingertips, and beyond those a ditch. Gently sided around its outer perimeter, it scarped steeply upwards on the wall side, as though designed to lure the unwary downwards, under the fire of the city's defenders. It was, Raven thought, a place of defense, forcing itself upon the land rather than living with the country. She liked the look of Quell. If anything, less than Lyand, to her surprise, Spellbinder skirted the walls, following the perimeter of the ditch for half its circumference. She rode conscious of the men watching from the towers, nervously waiting for the hiss of crossbow bolts or the heavier whistling of a catapult. Yet no sound came except the susurration of the wind, and they moved out of range with no shot fired. Spellbinder appeared sunk in some somber reverie, riding with shoulders slumped, his body drawn in upon itself and his head hung down. It was as though he let his mount pick its own way, careless of the direction, though she sensed he knew exactly where they were bound, and followed silently, blindly, willing to let the man choose the path. Soon enough they breasted a ridge of hard-packed dunes and began to descend into the wind-sheltered lee. Spellbinder turned his horse at the foot of the slope, steering it negligently to the east. They rounded the flank of a great sand hill and Raven saw, for the first time, the Temple of the Stone. Though she had never heard of the place other than in the utterings of Spellbinder and Mistress Clara, she knew it immediately for what it was. It could, simply, be nothing else, to the north and the south. The sand ridge disappeared into the shimmering light. To the east and west, a curtain of dancing heat haze spun and flickered from horizon to horizon, spreading a shifting golden glow across the desert. Riding into that aurora, Raven felt abruptly isolated from the world, as though she had crossed some unseen barrier, a mystic curtain that blanked off the rest of the world. Before her rose a squat shape that at first she thought to be a great slab of wind-eroded rock, pitched up from the desert floor. On closer examination it proved to be faceted with doorways and windows, its surface iridescent with flickering, changing tones of light. The substance reminded her of the fragment of stone hung in Mistress Clara's tavern, and she recognized the massive shape for some gigantic natural enclave tunneled out by men. It was, somehow, difficult to focus her vision, as though heat and light distorted the contours of the place, and she turned her head from side to side, seeking to distill clarity from the confusion. Dimly, she sensed rather than saw, man-like shapes moving around the entrances, felt something take her bridle, tugging the horse onwards. Spellbinder's voice came through the confusion, reassuring her, and she let her mount be led. She felt the light fade behind her, and for a moment was in total blackness, so thick as to press in upon her, goading panic into her mind. Then the darkness was replaced by a blaze of light so strong her eyes winked shut in instinctive defense. When she opened them again she found herself in a great cavern lit by reed torches that gave off more light than was natural. There was no stink of burning oil, no smoke curling across the dim, high-standing ceiling, only a clean, cold glare filling every recess of the place with stark, undeniable light, and the faintly damp smell of natural stone. She dismounted and followed Spellbinder through an archway that opened into a smooth-walled tunnel. Again light plunged into blackness, and she wondered if this was not some deliberate effect, planned to disrupt the senses of anyone entering the temple. Reflexively, her hand touched the dagger belted to her waist, though her feet continued to follow the pad of Spellbinder's footsteps as he strode down the lightless passage. Darkness erupted again into light, though now it was more mellow and she could see clearly the tall figure facing them. It was impossible, clearly, to discern the sex, for flowing robes of pure white shrouded the figure, and the voice that welcomed them was mellifluous as a maiden's, yet commanding as a man's. "Welcome," intoned the figure. "To the Temple of the Stone, come you to worship or to question?" "There are matters," Spellbinder chose his words with care, "that I would put to the stone." "Be it your will, High One, I would commune with the star gift." The stone priest paused for a moment, as though sensing some element of danger inherent in his visitors. Then he raised his arms, lifting the wide sleeves of his robe as a great white bird might lift its wings in preparation for flight. He brought his hands together. And Raven's ears were shocked by the deafening thunder of his hand clap. It was as if a storm broke within the confines of the rocky cell, bellows of thunder echoing from the walls to hammer against her senses. She almost staggered beneath the oral assault, her eyes watering as her head shook in an attempt to settle the ringing that filled her skull with painful sound. When the noise died away to silence again, she saw that 2 brown-robed priests stood before her. Of the white-robed one, there was no sign. Spellbinder tugged a leather purse from his sword belt, the coins within chinking as he tossed it to the nearest priest. The robed man caught the bag neat as any street thief and turned towards an opening Raven had not, previously, noticed. Close on her companion's heels, she followed the priests into the doorway. Again darkness, so black as to be almost tangible, and again that sudden chill of panic. Yet the priests moved on resolutely enough, and Spellbinder seemed to suffer no disruption from the abrupt changes. Raven stared into the velvet nothingness and followed the sound of the other's footsteps, ignoring the light her mind produced in compensation for the utter negation of light. This latest passage appeared longer than the others, though it was difficult to tell in the blackness, and she felt that they moved downwards, as though the tunnel probed the bowels of the desert. Then, suddenly as before, black became brilliance, one kind of sightlessness replaced by another. Raven stumbled, felt firm hands support her, and closed her eyes tight, letting the brightness filter in through the protective membrane of her lids. Gradually, far slower than she wished, the mind-swamping light faded to crimson, then to a dull red glow, and then to spangled black. When she opened her lids, the 2 priests were gone, leaving her alone with Spellbinder and the stone. They were inside an egg of rock. Floors and walls and ceiling welded into one continuous surface, curving around and up and down to meet in unseeable planes that defied sensible appointments, so that it was impossible to say surely which was which, almost impossible to stand upright, so confused as the eye. The surfaces were black amber and iridescent silver at the same time. There were no torches to illuminate the chamber, yet it was bright as white-hot iron. Her mind told her that it must be warm, yet she shivered, for there was both intense heat and utter cold within the chamber. And all seemed to emanate from the stone in the center. Then, with a shock of surprise, she realized that it was truly, at the center. It floated, midway between curved base and curved roof, its positioning exactly equidistant from every surface. And it pulsed as a living embryo beats within the womb sac. Now, Spellbinder said softly, turning towards her, let us ask the stone about the future. 5. The hand that guides the implement must equally control it, else tool guide the master. Against that, beware, the books of Carwin. The radiance within the chamber seemed to grow as Spellbinder approached the stone. The pulsing of the thing mounted so that Raven began to doubt her first assessment, that it was a cleverly hung puppet, controlled by the stone priests. When it shifted, spinning upon its own axis, then darting from side to side of the cell, she doubted no longer. And, as though happy with her belief, the thing ceased its movements, settling back to its original hovering position. It appeared to be stone, yet not stone. In outline, it was like a piece of smooth flint, blue-veined and smoothly shining, as though washed in the stream of time itself. But the veins shifted, moving as do a man's beneath his skin, its outer covering wavering as flesh above a fast-running pulse. When Spellbinder touched it, setting both his hands flat upon its surface, it calmed as a nervous horse quiets beneath the comforting grip of a confident rider. And a subtle transformation filled the silent chamber. Within the body of the stone, one light pulsed brighter than the others, and the radiance illuminating the cell died down. That single pulsation seemed to focus on Raven, a flinty eye probing deep into the hidden recesses of her soul. Gradually, almost reluctantly, she felt a mighty lassitude creep through her. It was both comforting and reassuring. Though she knew she should not fall into sleep at such a time, but sleep she did, or that was what it felt like, for she knew her eyes grew heavy, her limbs torpid, and soon she saw nothing but the blue glinting of that stone stare. Slowly, pervasively, images crept like slow tendrils of ivy through her blanked mind. She saw Lyand again, from the slave pens and the street. Saw her mother's face, that of Carl Ir Don Wayne, that of the slave master as he applied the brand. Arger's bearded visage was there. And Spellbinder's, and then there were things she could not understand. Unknown faces of men and women, and things between, some human, some bestial. She saw creatures that flew through skies of ice, and beings that dug through fields of snow. Great lizards spouted flame, and creatures almost human devoured one another. Warriors in metal clashed swords and axes in clamorous fight, and bright poisons dripped from ringed fingers while painted faces smiled. Jewels sparkled on smooth necks and silver-banded heads. Blood shone darkly on pitted swords, entrails dangled from pike points, the bloody pulsing of their excrescence becoming amethyst and ruby, glistening amber and sheening gold. Cities grew before her blind eyes. Towers of wood built skywards, were consumed in fire, rebuilt in stone. The stone crumbled. Was built up again, greater than before, only to fall again. Towers higher than any she had known, any she could imagine, argued with the heavens, and some roared flame, and hurled themselves against the stars. Chariots of metal and birds of steel wafted before her mind. She saw things that carried men as though horses invisible to eye, dragged them forwards faster than any horse could then run. Strange caterpillars that spouted smoke running faster the horseless vehicles, and still faster ones that made no sound, nor any disturbance of the air. She saw men fly as a bird does, and men in a blackness pricked by a myriad lights, clad in strange armor, creating cities of shining steel that hung in nothingness. She saw fountains of fire and mushrooms of smoke. Holes gaping into hell with skeletal faces grinning out. She saw swords that spat and killed, and stranger weapons that seemed to glow, their light withering flesh from bone, bone from marrow. Strange machines traversed a landscape she had never seen, spitting things that killed. And she saw men give up their lives for others in many ways. A very old man turned on a bed and died in his age, another screamed in a jungle as the strange weapons plucked away his life. Yet another hung from wooden poles with blood on his body, a fourth opened startled eyes as his brains spread down his face. One died with a smile as blood flecked his lips within a curious tent of some transparent material. And there were others, many others. Her mind reeled beneath the impact, for she knew she saw a vision of things to come, things that might be, things that could be. And knew, at the same time, that she was a part of it. And then a voice came into her mind. It was a voice that was not human. Yet more than human, terrifying as it was comforting, a voice that brooked no defying, but was accustomed to being defied. The sound of her name, spoken by that voice, was both commanding and comforting, the reassurance of a guardian spirit strong in her defense whilst still dependent upon her goodwill. It lulled her, it washed around her, wrapping her in tones of strength, resonances of subtle will. Raven, there is a thing you must do. What? Her reaction was instinctive, born of the need inculcated by the sonorous voice. Tell me, the world turns, Raven, though its spin may end at any point. A break is required, a pivot point, a place, a being, at which things rest in readiness to be shaped. You, Raven, are that focus. You are the axis of this world. Upon you depends the world. She shook her head, the enormity of the words striking through the mesmerization. No, how say you? No, it is too much. How can I be the turner of a world? Slave-born, I. Now what? An outlaw, no more. This thing you speak of is too great, I want it not. You have it. No. You, whatever you are, cannot force it upon me, no. No. Choose someone else. It is not a question of choosing, Raven. It is a question of being. There are those who seek such a mantle of destiny, and those upon whom the mantle falls, because destiny wills it so. You, for good or for ill, are one of the chosen. You cannot refuse the task, for the task will force itself upon you. We seek only to ease the burden. We? Raven asked, her voice tremulous with a mixture of fear and curiosity. How say you we? All existence intermingles. A man crushes a beetle and fledgling bird starves, because the bird ceases to exist, a flower is not pollinated. Because there are thus fewer flowers, a certain kind of insect breeds less young, those young would have fed fishes, their absence results in fewer fishes. A man who lives upon those fishes cannot find sufficient food, his child dies, hungry. Life is a circle, all things joining together so in the great chain of existence. Within that circle, death is as necessary as life. Thus it is that we are you, and you us, mingled forever, some to act, others to plan. You, Raven, are of the former. This focus, she said, how is it that I am it? Each being is a part of it. Worlds are shaped by the actions of individuals. It so happens that you stand astride a watershed in the stream of life. You are both blessed and cursed, for upon your actions depends the shaping of the future, and that is something you cannot deny or escape. But if I do nothing? The enormity of the mission described by that soundless voice frightened her. What then? How can you do nothing? Each step you take, each breath you draw, is an action. You are outlaw. You lust for revenge upon Carlisle Don Wayne. Will you give that up? Will you forsake your outlawry? Find some desert cave and become hermit? No. You are what you are, and you will, by your every nature, act out your part. The how of the matter is for your deciding. Tell me, she asked. What should I do? There is a balance in the affairs of the world that may be tipped to either side. This is a young world, and like a growing child, it flexes its muscles, striving to define its destiny. It can grow great or petty, a good world or a thing of confusion, the destination results from its early shaping. A child, growing, must learn for itself what fire is, the munificence and the danger of water, that some things are painful, others good. It cannot be told. For experience of the elemental matters is the only way to know them. And only through knowing them and understanding them, may a child grow straight and healthy. A child can be told that one thing is forbidden to the touch, another not, but until it understands that difference of its own volition, it cannot, truly, comprehend the difference. Just so is this world. There are those who would shape it for their own ends, create an order that will bring them to dominance as they subjugate others to their will. That is wrong. As metals are melted, blended to forge the finest steel, so must this world be shaped. Order, for now, is wrong. There is a need for chaos, as the steel needs the furnace. You, Raven, are that furnace, the catalyst of history. You are one of this world's pivot points, and upon you rests the destiny of the future. What must I do? Her voice was quiet, humble. Be yourself, act as you feel you must. Listen always to the advice of your greatest helpers, the man and the bird. And Don Wayne, she asked. What of him? Is he denied me? We cannot say. That you seek him is accepted, for only with the cooperation of the focus point may matters be properly guided. Therefore seek Don Wayne, though the finding may be long. Now he rests in Carsum, a favored captain of the Altan's growing army. To reach him, you must win equal favor with the Altan. That favor may be won through the bringing of the skull of Quez. Find the skull and you may have Don Wayne. The voice that was not a voice died away, and slowly Raven grew conscious of the chamber. Spellbinder on the far side of the floating stone, his hands still resting upon the pulsing surface. The concentration of light that had centered on her eyes faded away, until it was no more than another vein in the strange rock. And the rock itself faded, dulling, until it was no more than a chunk of stone large as two tall big men, poised at the center of the egg-like chamber. She shook her head as though clearing it of mind mist. And faced Spellbinder. Did you hear it? No. He moved away from the stone. The message was for you, no other. How does a stone speak? She recalled his earlier comments upon the thing. You said it was no more than a star thing, not a prophet. Spellbinder shrugged. The words were not necessarily those of the rock itself. The stone may act as a linkage between minds, passing thoughts from one to the other. Whose minds? Raven was quick to see the flaw in his explanation. Your hands were upon the stone. Were they your words that filled my mind? No. Spellbinder's voice was definite. I was, perhaps, linked with other minds, but I know not what was said. What other minds? Carwin? The sorcerer priests? Perhaps, said Spellbinder carefully, for those minds exert the greatest force upon this world. What were you told? Briefly, for she could not remember all of it, nor understand all of what she remembered, Raven told him. Spellbinder nodded slowly. The skull of Quez. That's long been the ambition of the Merstal Altans, though finding of it has proved harder than most men think. Yet, if the stone spoke the truth, said Raven, I must find it, but where? How? We must travel to Carwin. Spellbinder seemed almost to regret the prospect. If the skull is not there, at least they will know of its placement. Carwin. Raven's voice was odd. No man travels to the Isles of Ghosts. At least, not to return. Be you, as men say, Ghostborn, then you may survive the journey, but how may I? A smile lifted the thoughtfulness from Spellbinder's features, and he crossed the chamber to rest his hands upon her shoulders. What is, must be. If the skull of Quez rests in the ghost country, then we must go there to find it. And bring it to the Altan. If that is the only way you can reach Carl Don Wayne, will you be thwarted by stories of fantasy? Reluctantly, Raven shook her head, the tumble of blonde tresses sparking light from the glowing air. No, she said. If it be on the Isle of Ghosts, then there we must go, even though I like it not. Spellbinder said nothing more, simply took her hand in his to lead her from the chamber. It was as though he knew his way around the Temple of the Stone, for he strode through the sightless passages as does a man familiar with his ground, who needs no guide, nor light, to traverse the paths to his objective. They reached the great outer chamber without seeing another being, though Raven was curiously aware of activity all around her. And when they came into the chamber, there were priests waiting with their horses and fresh food. Spellbinder mounted without a word, and Raven followed suit, swinging into her saddle with thoughtful, far-seeing eyes. A priest handed them both a skin of water, moving his hands in mystic symbols before preceding them to the mist-shrouded egress. They rode away from the Temple of the Stone without a rearward look. 3 days later they were on the coast. The desert had given way to fertile seaplain. And the grass their hungry horses cropped led down to a small port. Barst, it was called, a tiny, wood-walled enclave of fishermen and migrant sailors, its walls containing a cluster of houses and shops, sprinkled with taverns. One of the latter provided accommodation and information, both. It was a clean place, and the food was good after the sparse rations of the desert traveling. It held a bathhouse in which they both spent long hours, soaking off the desert's miasma, and when they emerged, they resumed their bed companionship. For 2 cheerful days they lingered there, enjoying the careless happiness of the place. Then Spellbinder found a boat and the faint remembered words of the stone message were brought back to Raven. She unwrapped her armor from its foldings and decked herself as though for war. Mail shirt covered the lissom contours of her body, sword and knife and throwing stars girded her slender waist. Spellbinder, too, wore his armor of black and silver, though the war helm was slung from his shoulder. When they boarded the little boat, the master looked askance at their dress, choking down his second thoughts as Spellbinder tossed him a sack of coin. "Sail west," said the warrior. "The ghost all will show when it chooses."